the autumn of 1918. The First World War is ending, and Germany is losing. The generals who have run the country for years, who have commanded millions of men, can see the truth with perfect clarity. The war is lost on the battlefield. Their armies are broken, their allies collapsing, their soldiers exhausted, and in that moment, facing certain defeat, two of the most powerful generals in Germany make a decision that will poison their nation for the next 15 years. They decide it will not be their fault. They decide that when the surrender comes, the blame will not fall on the army or on the generals who lost the war. It will fall on the politicians back home, on the Democrats, the socialists, the civilians. They begin, quite deliberately, to construct a lie. And that lie will help destroy Germany's first democracy and clear a path toward one of the darkest chapters in human history. Most people think they know why Weimar Germany collapsed. The Treaty of Versailles, hyperinflation, Hitler, and all of those matter. But the real story is more deliberate and more unsettling than the version taught in school. Because Weimar's collapse was not simply an inevitable disaster driven by forces too large to resist. It was, to a striking degree, a series of specific choices made by specific people in specific rooms. And they did not have to make them. This is the true origin of Weimar Germany's collapse. And it begins with that lie the generals told. To understand it, you have to understand how the war actually ended. By late 1918, the German military high command, dominated by figures like Erich Ludendorff, knew the war was unwinnable. It was the military that pushed for an armistice, that told the government the fighting had to stop. But here is what they did next. As the new democratic government took shape and was forced to sign the humiliating armistice, and later the Treaty of Versailles, the generals and the political right began to spread a poisonous story. They claimed that the German army had never truly been defeated on the battlefield, that it had been on the verge of victory, or at least holding firm, when it was betrayed from behind. Stabbed in the back by traitors at home, by socialists, by Democrats, by Jews, by the very politicians who had signed the armistice. This became known as the stab-in-the-back myth. And it was exactly that, a myth. The army had been losing, and its own commanders had demanded the armistice. But the lie was politically irresistible, because it did two things at once. It shifted the blame for the catastrophe away from the military and onto the new democracy. And it poisoned that democracy from its very first day, branding the men who founded the Weimar Republic not as patriots trying to save a shattered nation, but as the criminals who had betrayed it. The Republic was born with a target painted on its back. And the people who painted it there were among the most respected figures in German society. That was the first wound, and it never healed. But the second blow struck at something even more personal than politics. It struck at money, at savings, at the basic security of ordinary German families. And it came just a few years later, in the great hyperinflation of 1921 to 1923. Germany came out of the war buried in debt and saddled with enormous reparations payments imposed by the victors. And rather than raise the brutal taxes needed to cover its costs, the German government and its central bank, the Reichsbank, increasingly turned to a simpler solution. They printed money, and then they printed more, and then they printed more still. The result was one of the most extreme hyperinflations in recorded history. The numbers become almost meaningless. Prices doubled in days, then in hours. A loaf of bread that cost a couple of marks before the war eventually cost hundreds of billions of marks. People were paid twice a day and had to spend their wages immediately, before the money lost its value by evening. Workers carried their pay home in wheelbarrows and baskets. Banknotes became so worthless that people burned them for heat, because the paper was cheaper than firewood. And here is a detail that captures the sheer madness of it. The head of the Reichsbank, during the worst of it, a man named Rudolf Havenstein, reportedly boasted of the bank's magnificent achievement in printing money, proudly noting the enormous quantities the presses could now produce each day, as though the ability to manufacture worthless paper faster than ever was a triumph rather than a catastrophe. He seemed to see the flood of money as a solution, not a disease. And who did this destroy? Not the wealthy, who held hard assets, land, factories, foreign currency. Not those with large debts, which were now trivially easy to repay in worthless money. It destroyed the savers. The careful, prudent German middle class. People who had done everything right, who had worked hard and put money away for decades, their savings, their pensions, all denominated in marks, were annihilated in a matter of months. A lifetime of security, wiped out. And that middle class, humiliated and impoverished, would never fully trust the Republic again. Their faith in democracy and in the basic stability of their world had been burned along with the banknotes. Now, the Republic did manage to stop the hyperinflation, and this is where the third act of the tragedy begins, an act disguised as a happy ending. In the mid-1920s, under the skilled statesman Gustav Stresemann, Germany stabilized. A new currency was introduced. And crucially, a deal was struck to manage the reparations problem, called the Dawes Plan, which restructured Germany's payments and opened the door to a flood of foreign loans, above all from the United States. American money poured into Germany, and for a few years, the later 1920s, Germany seemed to recover. Cities were rebuilt, industry roared back, culture flourished. Berlin became one of the most vibrant, creative cities in the world. This is the glittering Weimar of legend, the era of art and cabaret and modern experimentation, but it was built on a dangerous foundation, because that recovery was fueled, to a remarkable degree, by short-term foreign loans, by borrowed money and borrowed time. German cities, businesses, and government bodies borrowed heavily from American lenders. The whole prosperity was balanced on a continuous inflow of Wall Street credit. And that meant Germany's economic health was now tied directly to the health of the American economy, thousands of miles away. If that flow of money ever stopped, the entire structure would be exposed as hollow. And in 1929, it stopped. When the American stock market crashed in October 1929, and the Great Depression began to spread across the world, the effect on Germany was catastrophic. American lenders, suddenly desperate for cash at home, pulled their money out and stopped issuing new loans. The credit that had powered Germany's recovery evaporated, and the German economy, so dependent on that borrowed money, collapsed with terrifying speed. Factories closed, businesses failed, and unemployment exploded, rising into the millions, until by the early 1930s, something like 1 in 3 German workers had no job. Think about what that means on a human level. Millions of families once again plunged into poverty and desperation. First the war, then the stab-in-the-back lie, then the hyperinflation that wiped out their savings, and now, just as things had seemed to recover, a second economic catastrophe, throwing them into mass unemployment and hunger. An entire generation had watched their world collapse, not once, but again and again. And each collapse chipped away at their faith that democracy could protect them. It was in this atmosphere of despair that extremist parties, promising radical solutions and someone to blame, began to surge. And now we arrive at the part of the story that most popular histories underweight, the part that truly determined Germany's fate. Because the rise of extremism did not by itself doom the Republic. Here is the crucial fact. Even at the height of their electoral success in free elections, the Nazi party never won an outright majority of the German vote. They became the largest party. Yes, but a majority of Germans still voted against them. In a functioning democracy with committed defenders, that should have been survivable. So how did a party that most Germans voted against end up in total control? The answer lies, not with the extremists in the streets, but with the respectable men in the drawing rooms, the conservative elites. Germany's old ruling class had never truly accepted the democratic republic. The aristocratic landowners, the great industrialists, the senior army officers, the establishment conservative politicians, many of them longed for a return to a more authoritarian, hierarchical Germany, the kind of nation they had run before the war. They found the messy, egalitarian republic distasteful, and they had spent years working to undermine it. In the final years of Weimar, these elites made a series of fateful choices. As the Republic's democratic institutions strained under the economic catastrophe, they increasingly abandoned parliamentary government altogether. Small circle around the aging president, the war hero Paul von Hindenburg began ruling by emergency decree, bypassing the parliament, governing through presidential power rather than democratic majorities. They were, in effect, hollowing out the democracy from the inside, well before the extremists took over. And then came the final catastrophic miscalculation. By late 1932 and early 1933, these conservative elites faced a problem. They wanted to destroy the Republic and build an authoritarian government. But they needed mass popular support, which they did not have. The Nazi Party had that mass support. And so a group of these conservative power brokers, men like Franz von Papen, made a deal. They believed they could use the Nazi movement's popularity for their own ends. They would bring the Nazi leader into the government, hand him the office of chancellor, and surround him with conservative ministers who would, they were certain, control him. He would be their tool, their figurehead, a way to harness the mob, while the real power stayed in their experienced hands. They said, in effect, that they had hired him, that within weeks they would have him so boxed in he would squeal. They were catastrophically, world-alteringly wrong. Once handed the levers of state power, the machinery of government, the police, the legal authority, the new chancellor and his movement moved with ruthless speed to seize total control, to dismantle every check on their power, and to crush the very conservatives who had thought they were the puppet masters. The elites who believed they could manage him, control him, contain him, discovered far too late that they had handed the keys of the most powerful state in Central Europe to a force they could not stop. The tool had become the master. And that is the heart of what most versions of this story miss. Weimar democracy was not simply overwhelmed from below by an unstoppable wave of fanaticism. It was fatally weakened from above by the very people who were supposed to be the pillars of the German establishment. Conservative elites, who so despised democracy and so overestimated their own cleverness that they deliberately cleared the path for its destruction, believing they could control what came next. Now, honesty demands some balance here. Historians do debate how much freedom of action these elites really had. The economic catastrophe was genuine and immense. The pressures were real. Some argue the Republic was so besieged from all sides, by extremists on both the far right and the far left, by economic ruin, by the lingering poison of the war, that its survival was always desperately unlikely. That is a serious argument, and this is not a claim that a handful of villains single-handedly killed a healthy democracy. Weimar was wounded from birth and battered by forces far larger than any individual. But the deeper lesson still stands. At the decisive moments, human beings made choices. The generals chose to tell a lie rather than accept responsibility. The monetary authorities chose the printing press over hard decisions. Political leaders chose to build prosperity on borrowed money. And the conservative elites, at the final hour, chose to hand power to a movement they found useful, rather than defend the democracy they found distasteful. None of it was written in the stars. At each step, different choices were possible, and different choices might have led somewhere else entirely. That is why this history matters so much, and why it still unsettles us today. Because it is not, at its core, a story about a monster who rose from nowhere and hypnotized a nation. It is a story about respectable, powerful, intelligent people who thought they were being clever, who believed they could exploit extremism for their own advantage and shut it down whenever they wished. It is a story about how a democracy dies, not always in a single dramatic blow, but through 1,000 smaller decisions to weaken it, to blame it, to abandon it, to gamble with it, made by the very people who should have protected it. The path to catastrophe was cleared deliberately by those who thought they knew exactly what they were doing. Which leaves a question genuinely worth sitting with, and I want to know where you land on it. Do you think Weimar democracy could have survived if only different choices had been made at those decisive moments? Or was its collapse written into its very founding, doomed from the start by the lie it was born under and the enemies it never overcame? Tell me in the comments what you think, because historians still argue over this fiercely, and I do not believe there is a simple answer. And if this pulled apart a story you thought you understood, if you want more history where the real cause is hidden beneath the one everyone repeats, then subscribe and stay with us. Because the next story we are opening up is another moment where the world was told one thing, while the truth sat buried in the ledgers the entire time. You will not want to miss it,